All right, welcome back. In this segment, we'll start off talking about some different kinds of degrees of relationship that are really common in young adulthood. First off, there's, hookups. And I probably could have started off with like friends with benefits, right? Where it's not even really a hookup. It's sort of like an ambiguous relationship that you have where sometimes you're having sexual activity with each other and sometimes not, and mainly you're friends and like that. But hookups are, of course, basically about sex and are not intended to be long-term relationships. Sometimes they can be a little confusing. The two people involved in the hookup might not be exactly on the same page about where this relationship is going or whether this is supposed to be more. So they can be a little bit risky because feelings can get hurt. Dating is a term that modern young adults kind of reserve for a much more serious relationship than, like in my generation, we called it dating if you were going out on a date with somebody. So if you were meeting up to have coffee, we'd call that a date. And, if you went out for a movie the next weekend, okay, you are now dating, right? Like that's what we would call it because you've gone on two. I think it's a little bit more serious. That term is a little bit more serious for a modern young adult. I think it's considered more like when you're dating, you're a little bit more committed than I think my generation meant when we used that term. But dating is seeing the same person repeatedly. May start off, you're doing it in a group setting, and then dating may progress to become more one-on-one. For a lot of young adults, the next logical step, if this person seems basically acceptable, this seems like a person that I'm interested in finding out whether this could be my life partner or something, the next logical step is cohabitation. Here's a graph that kind of shows you how living with your spouse has gone down for the 18 to 24-year-old age group since the 1968, and living with your partner has gone up since 1968. Now, when I use the word cohabitation, I'm going to be referring to in heterosexual couples because historically, when this data was being collected, people of the same sex didn't have the option of getting married, and so you wouldn't want to call them cohabiting when they were living together as committed as they could be, right? Like that's not a fair comparison. Now that we have same-sex couples able to get married, they should be included in cohabitation as well. But I'm going to be talking a little old-fashionedly, and I'll just be talking about heterosexual couples that are romantic partners, right? We're also not talking about like friends, like honestly friends, maybe with the occasional friends with benefit thing, but they aren't thinking, nobody in the pair thinks that they're getting married. Like that's not what we mean by cohabitation either. That's called roommates. So roommates are not the same as cohabitation. When I was a young person, we called it living together, but that's a little long phrase, so we just call it cohabitation. In couples who enter into cohabitation, 70% of them plan on getting married, and they think they're going to marry the person that they're cohabiting with. They think it's a trial run for potentially getting married. Of those 70% of those cohabiting couples, though, 70% of them end up breaking up before getting married. So either it's a great sorting tool or maybe both partners were not necessarily on the same page as far as where this was really going. It's not really clear. Of those that get married, they will get married within 3 years of cohabitation. The remainders will either have broken up or will continue living together for, more. I'm trying to figure out an average number to give you that would make it make sense, but 10 years is not out of alignment. It used to be like 40 years ago that if you lived with somebody for more than 7 years, you would be viewed in the eyes of the law as married, called common law. No longer does that happen. So if you continue to live together for 15, 20, 30 years, you don't ultimately become married. There have been palimony suits that have come from long-time live-in relationships where we've lived together for 25 years and now we're breaking up. Can you, court, help us to separate our stuff and look at child support and alimony for us and other things? And so there has been some precedent set for how to sort of deal with breakups in cohabiting couples, but it's usually in couples that live together for, decades, not couples who live together for a few years. So one of the risks of cohabitation is that couples will enter into into the situation, planning to get married. They'll start to accumulate things together. They'll be buying furniture, or they'll maybe even buy a house or a car together, big ticket items. And then if they break up, there's no orderly way to go to a court and say, help us to separate this in a fair way, right? Instead, like, everything has to be sold and they divide up any proceeds that come from that kind of thing. It's a lot messier. That's one of the risks, for sure, is that you don't have the protection of the court to help you to figure it out. And if children occur during the cohabitation, sometimes the father doesn't end up with automatic child visitation. There's a whole bunch of things that aren't really protected under cohabitation that are protected when there's a marriage. And so it can get a little murky. If the couple doesn't go on to marry, it can end up with a lot of trouble. One kind of trouble is 20% of cohabiting women become pregnant within the first year of cohabitation. When I came upon this statistic, I was really surprised. I thought to myself, we've talked already in this class about the availability of reliable birth control, and it just really surprised me that 20% of cohabiting women become pregnant within the first year. So having unfettered access to having sex with each other, if you have an unreliable birth control method, it's going to reveal itself probably within the first year, right? So that's a huge risk, and children that occur in a cohabiting situation are not as well protected by the law as children who were born into a marital situation. And so now we have child support issues and visitation issues that aren't clearly defined, and so it can be really tricky. Speaking of marriage, let's talk a little bit about that. This happens for some young people still between 18 and 24, they'll get married. For a lot of couples these days, it's going to happen, well into official adulthood. I just wanted to say a couple things about marriage. You've probably heard that 50% of all marriages end in divorce. That's if you compute the statistic based on how many marriages occur within the given year and how many divorces occur within that same given year. So it's not any individual marriage has a 50% chance of failure. It's in any given year, twice as many people get married as get divorced, right? Like, that's basically how they compute that statistic. So much more informative is to follow couples over time. And that's what the Census Bureau does. The Census Bureau every 10 years asks if you're married and if you're still married to the same person and so on. And what they've found is that 72% of first marriages last at least 20 years. So that's a much more optimistic statistic than 50% of all marriages end in divorce. So keeping that in mind, there's a much more positive outlook for marriage. Surprisingly, marriages are less stable when the couple cohabited before their marriage, especially if this is the first marriage for both partners. So the very reason why couples move in and start cohabiting is because they want to see if this person really is the right person to marry. And it turns out that the act of cohabiting, the likelihood of cohabiting, I'm not exactly sure how to say it correctly, but cohabiting before marriage, when it's the first marriage for both partners, is associated with a higher risk of divorce. It is, okay, so let's flip some numbers and phrase it in a different way. So 72% of first marriages last at least 20 years. That means 38% of first marriages will end in divorce within 20 years. It turns out that it's 38% if cohabitation preceded the marriage, and it's 28% if it didn't. So if the couple does not live together before marriage, they have a lower chance of divorce. Now, it's probably not the act of cohabitation itself that causes a higher risk of divorce. It's probably personality factors and sort of social factors that are present in the individuals that make them more likely to cohabit and then also more likely to get divorced. For example, people who are in general a little bit more liberal are more likely to see cohabitation as a reasonable and fine thing to do, and are more likely to see divorce as a reasonable option if the marriage isn't fulfilling. So it could just be that this is how I look at the world in general about relationships. And so cohabiting makes sense in the context of that, and then getting divorced if I'm unhappy makes sense in the context of that. So it could be, sort of traditional values versus more liberal values might be the big factor there. Some research has shown that couples who cohabit have poorer communication than couples who don't cohabit. And so it could be maybe communication styles that the person brought with them into either the cohabitation or the marriage could be at play. Again, being an individual difference, something that the person brought with them or the couple brought with them. Emotional stability is another factor. People who are more emotionally stable tend to enter into marriages, and those marriages tend to be more stable themselves. People who are less emotionally stable are more likely to enter into cohabitation, and marriages that contain at least one emotionally unstable person are more likely to fail. So it's just a bunch of things that all kind of come together. But there is one thing about the act of cohabitation I want to raise, and it might play a factor. A lot of times in cohabitation, the partners are very egalitarian, so they don't adopt like rigid sex roles and say, okay, so I'm the woman, so I'll do the laundry. You're the man, so you mow the lawn. Like, they don't necessarily fall down those gender lines. In fact, a lot of times in cohabitation, everybody does their own laundry, or everybody equally contributes to whatever meal prep there might be, or everybody's sort of equally contributing. Also, during cohabitation, there is more, at least initially in the first 2 years of cohabitation, more sexual activity than there would be at that same point in marriage. And so it could be that because people tend to cohabit less than 3 years, that if you go from your cohabitation to getting married, you've moved into a period of your relationship where you were going to have a reduction in sexual activity anyway. The pressures of life and the routines and all the things that happen when you're with a person, no matter under what context, cohabitation or marriage, you start to get used to each other, and it's just like you start not having sex all the time. The couple may blame that change on having gotten married rather than recognizing it's because we've been together for 2 or 3 years now, with unfettered access to each other. And so they'll blame the act of marriage on that. And so they may be disappointed now, and they see marriage ruined it. So we may be contributing to chores while cohabiting in a way that we don't plan on doing when we get married, or once we get married, the demands on us change. A lot of times people get married because they're going to have kids. And so now the demands have changed. And a lot of times we find out that, the simplest thing to do is divide stuff up by sexual stereotypes. The mom is over here taking care of the kids, and the dad's over here taking care of the lawn and the home repair and whatever. And next thing you know, you're like, how'd we get here? This isn't what it was like when we were cohabiting. Marriage ruins everything, right? And so a lot of times when things change the way that they normally change as we grow and develop, but I saw it being different when I was cohabiting, and I see it being like this now that I'm married, I may blame it on being married and say to myself, man, marriage just really ruined our relationship. And so there are some aspects of how we behave in cohabitation that might make it seem like marriage is like to blame for why we're less satisfied. And so that might make it more likely that a person would exit the marriage. All right, I want to go ahead and stop here. We'll come back in the next segment and we'll talk about some, again, social clock kinds of age-based stuff and move on from there.